It started as just another ordinary afternoon. The Thompson family was sorting through an old box of keepsakes in their attic, faded letters, dusty trinkets, and yellowed photographs from generations past. It was a ritual they had done before, a way to reconnect with their history, to remember the people who came before them. But this time, something was different. As Emily, the youngest in the family, sifted through the pile, she pulled out a photograph that made everyone pause. It was an old black and white image, the edges curled and worn with time. The picture showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like an old farmhouse. Some faces were familiar, relatives they had seen in other family albums, but one man stood out. He was tall, dressed in an outdated suit, and had an unsettling expression. His eyes seemed to follow them, no matter which angle they looked from. "Who is this?" Emily asked, holding up the photograph. Her father, Richard, furrowed his brows. "I've never seen him before," he admitted, taking a closer look. His mother, Margaret, who had spent years tracing their family tree, shook her head. "That's strange. I don't recognize him either." The room fell silent as they examined the image. There was something eerie about the way the man stood, slightly apart from the rest, almost as if he didn't belong. It wasn't just his expression, it was his entire presence. A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. Curious and slightly uneasy, the family decided to dig deeper. They turned to the back of the photo, hoping for a name or date, but it was blank. A search through their family records led to nothing. It was as if this man had appeared out of nowhere and inserted himself into their history. But the real shock came when Richard decided to scan the image and enhance it using a digital tool. As the details sharpened, the family gasped. There was something in the background, something they hadn't noticed before. What they discovered would change everything they thought they knew about their past, and it left them with more questions than answers. Stay tuned, because this mystery is only just beginning. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the brightness and contrast on the scanned image. The details of the old photo sharpened, revealing something in the background that no one had noticed before. It was a shadowy figure, barely visible, standing near the edge of the frame. The shape was faint, almost blending into the trees behind the farmhouse, but there was no denying it. Someone or something was there. Emily leaned in closer, her heart pounding. "Dad, what is that?" Margaret, usually the most rational of them all, felt an uneasy chill settle in her chest. "Maybe it's just a flaw in the photo, an old camera glitch," she suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. But Richard wasn't ready to brush it off. He zoomed in further, trying to make out the details. The figure wasn't fully formed, almost like it was fading into the background. Yet, its outline was distinct enough to make out a head and shoulders. It didn't look like just another person from the past. It looked like something that wasn't supposed to be there. The family exchanged nervous glances. Who was the man in the suit? And more importantly, who, or what, was lurking behind him? Determined to get answers, Richard reached out to his Aunt Helen, the oldest living relative in their family. If anyone knew something about this photograph, it would be her. That evening, they video called her and showed her the image. The moment Helen saw the mysterious man, her face paled. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "It was in an old box in the attic," Richard replied. "Do you recognize him?" Helen hesitated before answering. "I've seen this photo before, but I was told never to ask about him." A heavy silence filled the room. Emily's pulse quickened. "Why? Who is he?" Helen took a deep breath. "I don't know his name, but when I was a little girl, I found this same picture in my mother's things. I asked her about it, and she got so upset. She took it away and told me to forget I ever saw it." She paused, her gaze flickering with something close to fear. "She said he wasn't supposed to be in our family's history." Margaret shivered. "What does that even mean?" Helen shook her head. "I don't know. But whatever the reason, my mother was terrified of him." And that's when the real mystery began. That night, the Thompson family couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Helen's words echoed in their minds. Asterisk, he wasn't supposed to be in our family's history. Asterisk, what did that mean? Who was the man? And why had their ancestors been afraid to even speak of him? Richard lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in his head. He had always been fascinated by family history, but nothing had ever seemed unusual before. This felt different. There was a weight to it, an unspoken truth buried in time. He knew he had to dig deeper. The next morning, he decided to search through the oldest family records they had, birth certificates, census records, anything that could place the man in their lineage. But no matter how far back he went, there was no mention of anyone matching the man's description. It was as if he had never existed. Yet, there he was, captured in an old photograph with their relatives. Meanwhile, Emily had a different approach. She decided to post the image in an online genealogy forum, hoping that someone might recognize the man's face or provide historical context. Within hours, comments started pouring in. Most people dismissed it as just another forgotten ancestor, but one reply stood out. Asterisk, you've seen this man before, but not in your family records. He appears in other people's photos too. Asterisk. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the message. She clicked on the user's profile and sent them a private message. When they responded, they attached a photo, one that looked eerily similar to the Thompsons' picture. The setting was different, but the man in the suit was unmistakably the same. Same posture, same haunting expression. The only problem: the other photo was from a completely different family, taken in a different state, almost 40 years earlier. Emily's hands shook as she showed the image to her parents. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "How can he be in both?" Margaret turned pale. "There's no way, that's impossible." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He looked back at their own photograph, his eyes drawn once again to the shadowy figure in the background. A horrifying thought crept into his mind. "What if he isn't just some forgotten ancestor?" he muttered. "What if he's something else entirely?" The family exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that they were no longer just looking at an old photograph. They were uncovering something much bigger, something that had been hidden for generations. And whatever it was watching them now. The air inside the Thompson house felt heavier now, as if the weight of the mystery was pressing down on them. The photograph, once just an old piece of family history, now felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, pieces that didn't belong in their past but had somehow forced their way in. Richard couldn't let it go. He spent hours combing through archives, searching for any mention of the man in old newspapers, obituaries, or public records. But no matter how deep he looked, he found nothing. Every person in that photograph had a name, a story, a traceable past, except him. It was as if he had stepped into their history out of nowhere. Meanwhile, Emily was glued to her computer, exchanging messages with a stranger from the genealogy forum. The more they talked, the more disturbing the pattern became. "I found another one," the person wrote, attaching yet another photograph. It was different from the others, older, maybe from the 1920s. But there he was again, standing in the background, his cold, unreadable expression exactly the same. Emily's pulse quickened. "This can't be real. How is this possible?" she typed. The reply was instant. "I don't know, but I think we're not the only ones who've noticed him." That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, flipping through their old photo albums. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time she had seen the man. There was something eerily familiar about him, but no matter how hard she tried to remember, the memory stayed just out of reach. Then, as she turned a page, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, again. This time in a different photograph entirely, one she had never thought twice about before. It was a picture from her own childhood, taken at a family reunion when she was no older than 6. The same suit, the same expression, standing near the edge of the group, just far enough to be overlooked. Her hands shook as she ran to show Richard and Emily. "He's in asterisk our asterisk pictures too," she whispered. This isn't just an old mystery. He's been following our family for years. Richard's face went pale. If he had been there decades ago, then he wasn't just an unrecorded relative. He wasn't just a forgotten man. He was something else entirely. And the worst part, they still didn't know why. Emily's fingers trembled as she flipped through more photo albums, her eyes scanning every image with a newfound sense of dread. The realization that this man, this unknown figure, had been appearing in their family's pictures for decades made her stomach twist. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just an unsolved mystery. It was something much worse. Richard sat in silence, staring at the photos laid out on the table. His mind raced through every logical explanation, but none of them made sense. If this man had been there during Margaret's childhood, and even in older images from other families, then he wasn't aging. He wasn't just an ordinary person lost to history. Margaret, still clutching the old reunion photo, whispered, "What if he's still out there?" No one answered. The idea was too unsettling to say out loud. That's when Emily's computer pinged, a new message. She turned back to the screen, expecting another reply from the genealogy forum. But this message wasn't from the same person. It was from a new, anonymous account. The subject line sent a shiver down her spine. Asterisk, stop looking. Asterisk. Emily's breath hitched. She hesitated before clicking on the message. It was short, just a single sentence. Asterisk, some things are meant to be forgotten. Asterisk. Her heart pounded in her chest. She spun around to show her parents, but before she could say a word, another message came in. This time, it was an image file. She clicked it open, and the blood drained from her face. It was a picture of their house. Not an old one, a recent one, taken at night. Emily's voice cracked. "Mom, Dad, someone's watching us." Richard rushed to the window, his eyes darting through the darkness outside. The street was quiet, the front yard empty. But the unease in his gut told him someone had been there. Someone who wanted them to stop digging. Margaret clutched her arms, her mind racing. This isn't just about the photo anymore. Someone knows we're looking for answers. And then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness. A sharp gasp escaped Margaret's lips. Emily scrambled for her phone, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. Then came a sound, a single knock at the front door. Slow, deliberate. And as the family stood frozen in the darkness, dreading what waited on the other side, Emily's phone buzzed again. A new message flashed across the screen. Asterisk, it's too late. Asterisk. The knock echoed through the dark house, slow and deliberate. No one moved. Richard held his breath, straining to hear anything outside. Emily clutched her phone, her hands shaking as she reread the message. Asterisk, it's too late, asterisk. Margaret reached for Richard's arm. "Don't open it," she whispered. Another knock, this time louder, more forceful. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned on her phone's flashlight, aiming it toward the front door. The light trembled in her hands. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice unsteady. No answer, just silence. Richard took a slow step forward, heart hammering. He had to know. He had to see. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. The porch was empty. The night was still. But something was there. Sitting on the doormat was an old, yellowed envelope. Richard hesitated before picking it up. His fingers brushed against the brittle paper as he turned it over. There was no name, no return address, only a date written in faded ink. It was the same year the oldest photograph had been taken. Margaret covered her mouth. That's impossible. Richard tore it open, revealing a single sheet of aged paper. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink smudged in places. He read the words aloud. Asterisk, you were never supposed to find him. He chooses who sees him. Stop now, or he will choose you too. Asterisk. A chill ran through the room. Emily felt the hairs on her arms rise. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Then something clicked in her mind. She grabbed the old photograph from the table and stared at it again. Her hands went cold. "Dad, look at this." Richard leaned in, his eyes scanning the familiar image. "What?" Emily swallowed hard. "The man. He's looking right at us." Richard frowned. "He always was." Emily shook her head. "No, he wasn't." She pulled up the scanned version on her phone, the one they had been analyzing for days. The original image showed the man staring slightly off to the side, his expression eerie but distant. But now his eyes were locked onto the camera. Onto them. Margaret backed away, her breathing shallow. "No, that's not possible." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The man in the photo had moved. The pallor flickered back on, casting long shadows through the house. But none of them felt relieved, because now there was something they couldn't ignore. The mystery of a man in the photograph wasn't just history, it was happening now. And somewhere, out there in the darkness, he was watching. The mystery of the man in the photograph wasn't just history, it was happening now. And somewhere, out there in the darkness, he was watching. The room felt colder now, despite the power being back on. The Thompson family stood frozen, staring at the photograph in Emily's shaking hands. The man's gaze, once distant, was now locked onto them, as if he knew they had uncovered his secret. Richard set the letter down carefully, his mind racing. He wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, but deep down he knew there wasn't. Whatever force had kept this man hidden for so long had been disturbed. They had gone too far. Margaret exhaled shakily. "We need to stop." Emily looked up, her heart still pounding. "But what if we're already part of this now? What if stopping won't change anything?" No one had an answer. The weight of the unknown pressed down on them. They had searched for the truth, but now that they had found it, they wished they hadn't. Richard took the photograph from Emily and slid it back into the old box, his hands steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He knew what he had to do. That night, without a word, he climbed up to the attic, placed the box of old keepsakes back where they had found it, and shut the lid. He hesitated for just a moment before turning off the light and leaving the past where it belonged. The following days were quiet. The house felt normal again, though an unshakable sense of unease lingered in the back of their minds. Emily deleted the scanned photo from her computer, Richard removed the post from the genealogy forum, and Margaret made sure the envelope was locked away, never to be opened again. They didn't talk about the man after that, not because they forgot, but because some things are better left unknown. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The mystery faded into the background, becoming just another strange family story, one they would never speak of again. But every now and then, Emily caught herself glancing at old photographs, searching for something, or someone, lurking in the edges of the past. And one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, she passed by the hallway where the family portraits hung. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. One of the frames was slightly crooked, and behind the glass, in the faded background of an old reunion photo, a shadowy figure stood. Watching, waiting. Emily turned away and never looked back.